Hey folks, thanks for coming to the infrastructure and DeFi panel. So it's going to be a great one over here. We got a bunch of friends and familiar faces. Why don't we start off with some quick introductions across the board?
Sure. I'm Austin Federa. I've been with the Solana project for about 4 years, and I run strategy at the foundation.
Yeah, awesome stuff. I'm Cooper. I'm a contributor and I work on the business team at Injective Labs. For those who don't know, Injective is a blockchain optimized for finance-based solutions. And excited to have this great conversation with you all today.
So I'm Ben Ekrit. I head special projects and engineering at DV Chain. We're the crypto side of DV trading, market making, venture cap in the space. So
Awesome. And to round it off, hey everyone, my name is Michael Powell. I am the head of marketing at Duro Labs working on Pith Network.
Awesome, and I'll do a quick intro myself. I'm the moderator over here. I'm Nero, CEO and founder of Multichain Advisors, MCA. We're a management consulting company that helps companies go from private to public and help with go-to-market and all that. So without further ado, let's start the panel over here and jump straight into the juicy stuff. So how do infra components such as price feeds and liquidity solutions help with the reliability and efficiency of DeFi?
Yeah, happy to kick off here, right? So Injective is essentially a blockchain built for finance. What does that mean? We provide module sets similar to a WordPress for finance, we would like to say. And the main module that we provide is this exchange module. It allows for folks to seamlessly build an exchange out of the box without having to build it from scratch like they would kind of on another chain. So with that being the case, kind of the most important aspects, the two biggest things are one, a price feed, right? And two, liquidity, right? And, partners like Ben and others need to have incredibly, great confidence that there will be, both uptime, one, and incredibly accurate data at all times and reliability of that data across assets. So I would say that, and I think it's awesome to have Pith on stage with us today, but they power almost all of the markets across both perps and spot for us. And specifically in the concept of a perpetual contract, it's incredibly important to have very low latency, very high, very reliable price feeds at all times. So in the context of what we do, price feeds are kind of everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a great point. And we often talk about T0 when it comes to the concept of time, right? And the further away you get from T0, the less valuable data actually is, right? So we get closer and closer to T0 because, as Cooper was saying, especially in the volatile space where things can change so quickly, if you're pushing a price feed update to a chain every 15 seconds, every 30 seconds, it's too slow, right? Things can change super quick, and then people can be left holding the bag. They can lose a lot of money, not due to any fault of their own, right? But because the data that they're using was not accurate. So making sure that it's real time, and oftentimes what we're doing at Pith is we're actually incorporating the pull model, right? Where it's actually price feed on demand. So you're getting real-time data exactly when that transaction is initiated.
Makes sense. Austin, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, you can think of a lot of these things from the perspective of what is the speed of the underlying infrastructure. So if you have a blockchain that's only doing one block every 15 seconds, one price update every 15 seconds is a totally viable model because your precision can never exceed your execution ability, right? And this is kind of like a thing to keep in mind is that if you are providing something that can do, let's say, like nanosecond price feeds, like you see in TradFi, right? Or microsecond price feeds, like you see in TradFi, if you don't have the ability to actually execute on that in less than a 10-second interval, that data feed, while it's useful for all sorts of purposes like model training, it's not actually going to necessarily help you on the execution side. And so I think what we saw is as we went from sort of, Gen 1 blockchains or Bitcoin, Gen 2 blockchains or things like Ethereum, you have Gen 3 blockchains, which represent, Solana, as well as some other, L2s that are trying to be about as fast as something like Solana. What we're really talking about there, people always focus on the TPS increase, and TPS increase is important, but there's basically two ways to increase your transactions per second. You can do more blocks per second, and you can fit more things into each block. And so Solana runs at about 400 millisecond block times. And for that, you need price feeds and oracles that are able to update at a minimum of 400 milliseconds. Now with Solana, we actually have, there's these shreds, which are basically sub blocks within a block, and those are even faster. And so you can take advantage of price feeds that are updating every 50 milliseconds on something like Solana because of the network architecture there. But if you're running this on networks that don't have that, right, this is kind of like whenever we lower the lowest barrier, all these other sorts of downstream infrastructure have to update. You can run an auction for block time, over 30 seconds if you have blocks that are only produced every 30 seconds. If you look at something like Jito, its MEV calculations have to be done in much shorter amount of time than in something like Flashbots because there's literally less time to build a block. And so a lot of these things, they all kind of have cascading failures or increases where the fastest part of the system is always the limiting factor that'll drag the rest of the infrastructure to also become more efficient.
That makes sense. Speed being a topic, how do different blockchain characteristics such as transaction throughput and latency impact the DeFi experience and the trading experience?
Yeah, to start off with, we talk about two very different things. We talk about transaction per second capacity and what the latency and finality is. So you can have systems that are capable of pushing through tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of transactions per second, but it can't do it in a synchronous model, right? And this is sort of the L2 model for scaling Ethereum is we're going to basically fracture the state, and each piece of that state is going to be able to move in a higher transaction per second. And, maybe in aggregate, we can hit 10,000 transactions per second, but we now have 12, 13, 14, 20 different execution environments where that's all competing. And so you suddenly have a problem of fractured markets, right? Like, why do we have consolidated trading markets in TradFi? It's because there's, economic opportunity and competition and being in one global state. And so the thesis on Solana is that as much as possible, we can keep this all in one layer and have that global competition within that one state. You're going to get more market opportunity there than you're going to get when we start fracturing state out into different places. Now, one of the trade-offs of that is that, block times on Solana are 400 milliseconds. And that's because there's a 1,600 plus validator set, and there's global coordination that takes time. You can run Solana much quicker, and this is sort of like Pyth runs a fork of Solana that's a private proof of authority network, and they have the ability, I don't think they run it that much faster, but they could run that with 50 millisecond block times if they wanted to, because they don't need 1,600 nodes participating in something like that. So all of these things end up being different types of trade-offs. If you look at like Phoenix, which is the central limit order book on Solana that was built by the Ellipsis team there, that thing is actually running faster than Solana block times because they're doing some part of that work off-chain. But sort of the goal there is to figure out like what is sort of that Pareto-optimal trade-off between latency and decentralization and block time production. This is sort of like it's not like some well-formulated thesis, but like the trilemma is basically solved at this point. What we're dealing with is like the next trilemma, which is latency, and scalability, and are you operating in how many different fractured states? And I think one of the things people have underestimated is how difficult it is to do DeFi well on L2s. And that's not because an L2 can't be really great for DeFi. It's that you have to communicate across multiple different L2s to actually get like well-coordinated markets and price feeds, and that's a quite hard thing. An individual L2 can be good for a DeFi execution, but then the minute you try and move that out, suddenly the entire market dynamic changes. And this is sort of why in like the TradFi space, there's this HFT firm rush about who can get a message from Tokyo to Chicago faster so you have an arbitrage opportunity, right? DeFi is like just starting to get to all this stuff. This is where things like price feeds and bridges are really important in kind of helping to build that out over time.
Yeah, I think Austin hit the kind of the nail on the head there in the first question from a network perspective, right? In terms of how networks are built and how price feeds really fall within them. I also like on the other side of the coin to take it from the user perspective, right? So let's think about latency from a user perspective. Currently, I can go onto Binance, I can go onto Coinbase as, let's say I'm trading perps, and I can have this, nanosecond or sub-second, user experience. However, now, what's the trade-off, right? If I come on chain, The trade-off is that what kind of experience do I have? Do I have to wait 14 minutes for finality, right? Oh my God, why would I, trade a perp on chain? Maybe self-custody, maybe, some other optimization. So from our side of things at Injective, right, we've built, we're closing in on Solana, but still far off at 650 millisecond block times. But with that being the case, we believe the same kind of construct, that the user experience has to be as close to as similar to that TradFi experience, and those kind of nanosecond block, that TradFi kind of experience and execution timeline, but also provide the additional benefits of running this entire thing on a distributed ledger and having everything totally transparent. So I would say that latency, from when going to a lot of these different HFT firms and saying, hey, come on chain for one of the first times ever and provide liquidity to our central limit order book, it's far more technical. The integration is far more difficult. And, you're going to have to pay an additional engineer that's incredibly probably expensive to hire to make this integration. Yep. Sometimes Ben can tell you, right? And when doing so, they say, hey, this is so much different than our experience on, let's say, a Binance or a Coinbase or even the New York Stock Exchange, right? However, with that being the case, you then have to, get back to that question of trade-offs and figure out, right, what are the biggest benefits and how can we optimize for both sides of the experience and give that user a better experience. So I definitely think latency is probably the best piece that, if blockchains can optimize for, can provide that kind of trading experience, push things forward.
Yeah, maybe I'll roll with that there. It's like, we'll look at it from two different user perspectives too, right? We're traders. The most natural thing for any of us coming from TradFi is latency. Like, it's the first thing you think about. Going 400 to 650 milliseconds for blocks already feels, let's be honest, it feels slow when you come from TradFi. It's a very, very different experience. Yeah, you got to chew the glass a little bit and figure out how you're going to deal with that and how you're going to update and approach your strategies for that. But it goes beyond that. It's not just throughput and it's not just latency. Like, those are both important, but it's also reliability, right? Like, and finality both matter too, because it's not just your latency to like do an action, it's your latency to understand what's been completed and how much do I trust what's been completed. Is something going to revert on me? Do I need to wait 7 seconds to know for sure my position? That's an eternity in the trading world. And the better you can solve all of those things, that makes a much better user experience for any of us on the trading side, which I think then dovetails into better user experience from the retail side. Retail's not going to be terribly, shouldn't be terribly sensitive to like 400 milliseconds, 600 milliseconds, 2 seconds, but they do care about finality. They do care about what's going on. But also they deserve to get real liquidity. They deserve tight markets. They deserve not to have a ton of slippage. And you get that by putting together a system that makes institutional users happy and can rely on things. So
Totally. And for those listening, to think from kind of Ben's perspective, speaking to an exchange, right? Let's assume that price discovery is occurring on Binance or Coinbase right now, and it's happening in a nanosecond or microsecond occurrence, right? If it takes him 10 seconds to cancel and remove his orders on some on-chain venue, he then has 10 seconds of potentially a price movement where he can lose money, right? So the more you can break down that amount of time is absolutely crucial to convince those large liquidity providers to come on chain and provide liquidity. And really the general concept of how do we get users long-term on chain is that liquidity begets users, and you really can't get the user without those deep, pockets of liquidity and money on chain. So anyway, I think that latency, just to add on there, is really everything to be able to pitch to someone like that.
yeah, it's the first metric for sure. Yeah.
Awesome. No, appreciate it, guys. And also, when you guys are speaking, just make sure your mic is close by so we can all hear. So next question over here. How do on-chain and off-chain technologies complement each other to be able to create trading efficiencies and innovation in the DeFi space?
Yeah, I'd say probably my spiciest version of this is I don't like this new trend where DeFi is starting to use off-chain compute. There's a lot of reasons for this. Like there are some limited applications like ZK circuits where like maybe it's acceptable, but the minute that you're pushing your order matching or something like that off chain and you're just treating on chain as settlement, Binance has basically on-chain settlement, right? Like, no, it doesn't, right? But at the end of the day, the amount of trust that you have in a centralized trading venue, from a moment-to-moment standpoint, is quite high, right? The risk of, even when something like an FTX occurs and like the centralized exchange completely collapses, every single professional trader basically had pulled their funds off of it. Like they could see what was going on, and like you have an exit plan for these sorts of things. And so I think if we sort of start compromising DeFi and pushing a bunch of the compute off chain, I kind of ask what the point is at this point. Like at that point, like, something like Cube Exchange, where they have like self-hosted MPC wallets that are like represent your balance on chain, that you and the Guardian network can remove your funds from the centralized exchange at will. Like that's basically better than DeFi at that point if we're pushing all the compute and order matching off chain. And so I think it's kind of a mistake that it's not most of it, but some of the DeFi ecosystem has started to move in that direction. And it feels like maybe it's a reasonable product decision to deal with limitations of compute that you can get on certain networks, but just migrate to a different network at that point, as opposed to, I would say, compromising like the core value proposition of your product, because centralized trading venues are always going to have more liquidity, tighter spreads, lower fees, faster execution than DeFi will, at least in the foreseeable future. And if you're not competing on that anymore, like what are you competing on?
That makes sense. Any other thoughts?
Am I supposed to take the other side there? I don't know.
Whatever you want.
So we are big fans of on-chain, fully on-chain. I think it's a good ideal, right? And conveniently, both the chains sitting here on stage are fast enough, are ones where we can happily work at that. But I think I would generalize it a little bit further is, and we see this in the AI space as well. I know this is a DeFi trading panel, but for hypercompute intensive things, a chain isn't really the right place for it sometimes. And if you're dogmatic about everything has to be perfectly decentralized, I mean, we're going to give up. There's a trade-off somewhere there, right? And there's performance. Like an on-chain exchange, we got to be honest, it's never going to be as performant as centralized matching. And if you push stuff as far as, like, say, Cube has, where you have a lot of control over those wallets, that does give a little bit of transparency to us that we can have a little bit of extra comfort with. Not more comfort than we have, say, like on Injective, where, like, out of the box, we can do stuff like it has some nice tools out of the box for even delegating control over your trading keys and segregating things that way. I love that side, but there are sort of ideals we can push to in between for compute intensive things where you can be centralized for your matching engine, but like let's use some of the other stuff we've learned in decentralization, right? We can do disperse validation of code and run stuff in trusted execution environments and write it back on chain. And there is a best of both worlds for some applications there that I don't know. It depends what user experience are you optimizing for, and something that needs latency or intense compute. Sometimes like blockchain isn't the be all end all for the compute piece. So.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would say is like you're putting a lot of a trust in TEEs at that point. And historically what we've seen is that like Intel can't build a decent one, right? And so like the place that kind of gets you with this is you end up bringing in significantly more trust assumptions into a system that is supposed to be censorship resistant and bulletproof. And that's not to say that like if you're a professional trading operation, there aren't many reasons you want to run a bunch of systems off chain. But fundamentally, like a professional trading organization that's showing up to trade on blockchain, they're not doing it because they're like committed to the values of blockchain. They do it because they're committed to their underlying profit. And there's nothing wrong with that. Profit's great. We're all capitalists. But like, I think it's important that when we look at something like a Uniswap or something like that, we're not compromising how those systems run for the sake of additional efficiency, because the goal of blockchains has never been efficiency, right? It's been censorship resistance. It's been self-sovereignty. It's been decentralization. And so if we can push DeFi and, trading venues that DeFi supports to be as performant as possible within the moral bounds of the system we've created, that, at least for me, feels like that should be the goal. And there's definitely people who will build hybrid systems and those sorts of things, but they're not really replacements for those other forms of self-custody DeFi. And like, a bunch of us sitting in like, like Western Europe and the United States and these sorts of places, like it's very hard to understand the risk that centralized trading venues pose because we have quite well regulated markets.
Yeah, that's really true.
Yeah. And then if you're, if you're in a more developing country, there are like significant capital controls and things you can move around. Like when Russia invaded Ukraine, the entire banking system just shut down. They got cut off from the SWIFT network. And for a lot of these sorts of things, this is where I think DeFi really proves its merits out.
Yeah, I mean, just to add in there quickly, I completely agree with Austin on our end. We're actually one of the first places that runs every aspect of the trade on chain for several years now, being live on mainnet. The team pioneered something called frequent batch auctions, also known as FBA, where essentially we clear all different kind of, every single trade gets cleared at the end of a block, and it allows for execution to occur on chain. And it's funny because a lot of people come to us and they say, hey, this fully on chain DEX, essentially the way the architecture of your exchange has been built is kind of, a little bit more complex than what exists across other competitors that I will not name. And that's because they're matching in AWS, right? And then at that point, the question is like, is this really an on-chain exchange, right? From your perspective, yeah, they have a token, we have a token, you know what I mean? But like at the end of the day, right, like you're just a centralized exchange with the token now to some extent, and you have self-custody, right? And self-custody is a huge addition as well. But I think I completely concur now when we see some of the names that brought a lot of us into the space, specifically me, the Uniswaps of the world, now saying, hey, we need to focus on user experience. It's kind of like, how did you get to where you were and what are the, your first principles? And I think the first principles of many of these DeFi projects should be the construct of, censorship resistance and really being able to provide the best kind of user experience in the case, like the same construct of blockchain technology and why we even started building in this space to begin with.
Yeah, last thing that I'll add on that point, I think what Austin said is exactly right. It's kind of how closely aligned to the ethos do you want to be and what space do you want to play in. There are choices that you can make, and we've seen a lot, especially in the L2 space with ZK rollups and with off-chain data aggregation of where that compute takes place, who's going to kind of bear that cost. I can think of a few examples on Arbitrum and Optimism, right, where they're actually able to make it a more cost-effective experience for the users. But of course, there are trade-offs there.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. What are the key challenges and solutions of integrating real-time price data into DeFi platforms?
Getting the data on chain, right? And then, so like, this is not like price feed related at all, but just like at the base level, one of the hardest problems is how do you get data onto a network and then propagate it throughout the network in the fastest amount of time possible. That is something that, large centralized Web2 companies like have spent billions of dollars trying to do, right? Google's like 50 millisecond search response time from anywhere in the world doesn't just magically happen, right? There's a hell of a lot of engineering that goes into like making something like that actually work. And I think for blockchains, that is like the next frontier to really tackle is we're basically still using like the public internet for all this stuff and like non-specialized networking. And so that's kind of probably the next foray is like, how do we actually get state propagation to happen globally at a much more fast rate than it currently does?
Yeah,
Totally.
Sorry.
Please, I was going to say like to that same point, right? It's like, how do solutions like, it's essentially like we have this Pyth price feed, it's delivered on chain right now. How do we push it across the network? But really it's a question of how does Pyth come up with this on-chain price feed to deliver to the end consumer?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, my answer to that was just going to be really boils down to availability, right? I think when you look at kind of the first generation of price feeds and the Oracle model, it was setting up new nodes for every chain you wanted to expand to and says, we're going to go out and source this data for you. Oh, you want to go cross chain? You're thinking about interoperability. We have to set up more nodes. Those price feeds aren't available there. It's going to cost you tens of thousands, right? So what Pyth has done with PythNet and our partnership with Wormhole, we're actually able to propagate all 500 plus price feeds to every chain that we're on. I think it's like 77 right now. So that's kind of what we view as the next generation of the price feed update model.
Yeah. But it's hard then because even after you get that price feed, like let's say you do a pull request from an oracle, right? That price fee is now included in a transaction on the chain. That's great. Let's even say that happens, in 50 milliseconds. You still then have to propagate that state change out to the rest of the network to be able to like use it at some point, right? And that's kind of where you run into these sort of problems where, like, as we were saying before, like if the oracle is updating every 50 milliseconds, it doesn't matter if your block times are 12 seconds. Right. And so that's kind of that state propagation change through a blockchain network is still super slow on most networks. Even on Solana, 400 milliseconds is super slow, right, from a trader perspective.
But can you go any faster than that and still hit global propagation per block? Like,
I mean, it depends, right? A lot of this comes down to it's about 150 milliseconds, right, to get anywhere in the world at the furthest point. And so you should be able to get these things down to 200 milliseconds at some point. It also gets to this whole concept of multiple concurrent block producers, right? Is that we're assuming right now that there's only one ingest point for a block. What if there were two ingest points for a block? Then suddenly that 150 milliseconds cuts down to 75. Right, for the nearest point to get included, right? This is like the colo problem is super real, right? Like there's one Binance API ingest point and everyone's co-located around it. And like it's basically the same problem you have with the stock exchanges where, there's all this competition to be as close to them as you can physically be. What if you can split that up into multiple ingest points and you have time alignment and basically what you're doing is asynchronous execution. We already have block producer, block execution separation on some networks like Ethereum. There's no reason that you can't have multiply concurrent blocks produced that are then zipped up in the next block together. And at that point, you actually get a delay in propagation where you can effectively get around the world in less time. Now, the execution takes a little bit of a hit, but you still might be the settlement takes a little bit of a hit, where maybe your settlement is still in 400 milliseconds, but you can get confirmation of execution in much less. But that's all kind of next.
That's an interesting take.
Yeah.
All right, last question over here. How can emerging technologies and innovations in the trading infrastructure space lead to growth in DeFi technologies?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from not necessarily like the TradFi piece that's like all the people who like talk about TradFi, but like the actual engineers who've been building trading systems for computerized trading systems are pretty old, right? There's been 30 years of folks really hammering on those type of systems. And there's a lot we as an industry can learn. There's a lot of good reasons we tried not to learn a bunch from TradFi at the beginning, because blockchain started as a response to a bunch of folks who didn't know what they were doing crashing the economy, right? That is the beginning of Bitcoin. But the engineering side, there's a ton that can be brought to bear in terms of making blockchains more efficient. This is what the whole FireDancer project on Solana is all about. There's a bunch of high-frequency trading engineers thinking about how they can build a validator client differently. I think we're going to see more and more of that type of thinking applied to different types of blockchain networks, not just Solana.
Yeah, I think that's a great take. I think on my end, I think currently you have, from a liquidity perspective and what's super interesting long term, you have like dumb liquidity, which I would say are like these kind of legacy AMMs. And then you have kind of smart liquidity, which are these central limit order book architectures with more institutional capital posting orders on a second by second basis and canceling and replacing. And I think the very interesting model is where both of those come together and essentially take some form of smart contract driven liquidity provisioning that's also being informed by external information, likely coming from some form of price data, like a price feed, and being able to update liquidity on a moment by moment basis. I think machine learning also could potentially fall into something that becomes super interesting, and how essentially a vault could provide liquidity to these different potential markets, right? That's fully driven by some form of on-chain compute and some form of price data that's coming on chain. So essentially, some big institution is currently, like Citadel is making all this money, market making, right? The construct of a smart contract being able to go there long term, and essentially, as opposed to an X times Y equals K curve, that same central limit order book experience. However, instead of that cancel and replace coming from a singular entity, a smart contract being able to do that at scale.
I know. I like that take a lot, actually. Yeah, some of my ideas on where innovation can go on this might again go in the against the hot takes of others here too. But I think for trading, and this is a little bit more broad too, is like user experience still needs to improve, still needs to come first, and like any innovations that you're seeing people push out there where it abstracts away the complexity for retail traders, for consumers that are coming to market, still pushing that way, make it easier to self-custody, make it easier for somebody to get their assets on chain and not have to worry so much across the different chains, right? So again, some of that simplifies a little bit when you're on Solana or Injective, where you can do what you want to do in one place. We obviously have a much more fragmented world across the EVM ecosystem. So people putting together solutions that really make the user just see one front end and not have to deal with complexity across chain. And this is somewhere where I would actually push back on the whole, like, this is a place to actually leverage. Yes, I know we're traders and market makers, so maybe I'm talking my own book here, but it's a place to leverage like us, like our sort of firms, put the risk on us, right? Like intense solutions that make settlement risk, timing risk, and all that, and the capital cost bared by people who this is their job to do it, and gives like the retail end user near instant finality and a really nice snappy user experience. Feels like a good balance of both worlds, and at least then you're getting a good service, what you're paying the market makers to do and the risks they're taking. Yeah, I also like what you're saying, Austin, about there are some lessons from TradFi, like as someone who was an active prop trader at a bank while we were melting down the world back in 07 and 08, like, we've worked with like hundreds of different crypto projects and protocols over the years, right? We've been full-time in the space since 2016. And one thing that surprised me a lot was over and over and over again, people saying, we don't need anything from that space. Look, there's a lot of things to improve on, 100%. That's why we're here. That's why we all want to be on chain. But we did learn some lessons a long time ago about how to keep track of state, why we care about price oracles and like truth for price and trying not to have bad prints around. Like those are some lessons that we should keep incorporating into the solutions as we go forward. So, yeah.
I love that. Yeah, and actually that kind of makes me think of what the Morpho team is doing with their vaults and kind of separating the protocol from the risk side and allowing vault operators to come in and kind of manage that front end experience, have a little bit more control. But I'll take the opposite angle from the user experience side and just talk more about the infrastructure side. And I think what we really see as kind of the next frontier is how we can improve infra across speed, cost, and trust. Right. And when you look at it, it's been brought up a lot around kind of that TradFi, Charles Schwab type of trading experience where the latency is about 300 milliseconds. It feels instant. It's free. You can go on there and just trade. There's no $0 fees, and it feels awesome. Right. And so we are all about how can we get DeFi to that point to where it feels awesome. And we believe that advancement from the infra side is going to enable the adoption.
Awesome, guys. Thanks again. I think we're over on time, but appreciate you guys' time and looking forward to the future DeFi.
Thank you.
Thank you.